Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to How to Review an Experimental Paper presented by IFT's Early Career Researchers Program. I'm Amanda Ferguson. I'm the director of IFT's Scientific Journals. If you're not already familiar with IFT, we're a nonprofit scientific society that was started in 1939. We're headquartered in the United States, but we serve the global food science community. Our journals program directly supports IFT's mission and vision by promoting and advancing the science of food through the research and review articles that we publish. The journals uphold IFT's core values with our editor, author, and reviewer communities, which include a diverse network of scientists worldwide, and by upholding research integrity through the highest standards in education on best practices, such as this webinar on how to review. IFT convenes a global community focused on improving the food system. We have nearly 11,000 members that come from 90 countries, representing over 3,000 organizations and 500 colleges and universities. We span the global food value chain with members across sectors of the workforce. And our student association, IFTSA, is a network for students which provides additional resources and networking opportunities. The Feeding Tomorrow Fund supports the development of emerging food science professionals through scholarships and grants. And as we get started, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. You can use the chat to post your resources and insights, but please submit questions for the panelists using the Q&A feature. This is being recorded and will be posted to IFT's YouTube channel, and we'll send you the recording link early next week. And with that, I would like to introduce you to IFT's Early Career Researchers Program leader and our moderator for this discussion, Professor John Coupland. John, you can take it away.
Thank you, Amanda. My name's John Coupland. I'm a professor here at Penn State University, and I'm leading this initiative for IFT. Reviewing is something that's a big part of our careers as scientists. We all depend on this kind of peer review process as a guarantee, or at least hopes to be a guarantee of the quality and integrity of our work. But sometimes we don't talk enough about what it means to review a paper and what an effective review really looks like. So I'm really pleased to be able to have some experts in the area, people with real experience, to talk about it. This is the first of the webinars the Early Careers group will be doing, and later ones will look at different aspects of reviewing, the editorial process, and publishing ethics. So if you see value here, I hope you'll be able to join again for the later ones. So with that, I'd like to start to introduce our speakers. We have Dennis Gladys from Virginia Tech, we have Joe Regenstein, and we have Karen Wong from Nankai University. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in turn, but so please, for each panelist, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your kind of history, what brought you here, and perhaps if you feel open to sharing, you could tell me something about how you got started in reviewing, or an early review that you received. So I'm going to defer to Joe Regenstein to lead us off. Joe.
Thank you. I am Joe Regenstein. I'm a professor emeritus, so I've been in business a long time. I'm at Cornell. I also teach a course at Kansas State on kosher and halal food, which people are aware of my interest in that area. I've been on the editorial board of comprehensive reviews in food science and food safety for what feels like forever, but we seem to think it's about 20 years. And that gives me a chance to review papers, but we're focused today on experimental papers. I also had the honor of starting a journal, in fact, the first English language food science journal that was sponsored by a Chinese university's Food Bioscience, which has had a fairly successful start, and I'm now emeritus on that project also. But that was an interesting chance to look at papers further in the process. In other words, after the reviewers have come on have finished their reviews, the associate editors had accepted the paper. I then began to work on the papers. And in the spirit of Fred Kroger, who we use as our award person and is at Penn State, I'm sure John knows him well, who really edits papers thoroughly. I literally edited every paper that was accepted. One of the interesting things on that was sometimes I felt science was not what I would have hoped for. And sometimes I had to work with the authors quite a bit to bring the paper up, both editorially and scientifically. I should say, in terms of my own reviewing, I can remember an early paper. I can't say it was my first, actually, as an author, but of reviewers that sort of bothered me in that one of my students had submitted a paper without showing it to me. So that was an awkward issue to start with. And the reviews came back. One came back absolutely critical of exactly the kinds of things I would have corrected had he shown me the paper. He was under pressure in his own country for that paper, obviously. He was not an American citizen. But one reviewer came back and said, this paper is perfect. Publish it exactly as it is. And that was when I realized, first of all, those kind of reviews are useless because it has nothing of substance. And secondly, it felt disingenuous. It was like somebody had gotten to be a reviewer and didn't take their responsibility seriously, skimmed the paper and got it off their desk. And I think that, for me, set me off on the route I've taken, which is a very heavy involvement in each paper, because I felt you're doing a disservice to science and the scientists if you take reviewing less than totally seriously. And I'll stop at that.
Thanks for all your hard work, Joe. That sounds a ton of work. Karen, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you get to be where you are.
Hello, my name is Wang Ruitan, and you can call me Karen as well. I'm currently an associate professor at Nankai University in Tianjin, China, and I was a postdoc at UW-Madison. That's where I started to work with international researchers and to learn how they see things differently from their own angle, basically, and also learn their culture. I think is very important as well. And I've been an editorial board member and a part-time editor for JFS for about 3 years now. And um, and in terms of reviewing, I think I started my reviewing experience early on back in the days when I was a PhD student in China. Because, well, I don't get papers assigned by myself, assigned to myself, but I occasionally my PI, my advisor, will let me look at his review tasks. Well, he would do it by himself, but sometimes he would just ask my opinion on that because he thinks it's a good way for me to develop critical thinking as I'm trying to learn how to be an author. So basically, I have to, it helps me better correct my vision on how to write a scientific paper and also have developed a taste on that. I think that is a very big, a very good, very important experience for me. And then when I finished my PhD and and I started review papers independently, and then I see myself as a semi-mature a reviewer, then I think it's better for me to start, from scratch on. I will probably get very nervous and I need more education on that because back in that time, we don't have any resources like webinars like this, like how to review a paper. But because I've been trained to do that, I think it's better for me to, just do a good job independently when I start my own reviews. I think, for reviewers, I think this type of educational programs are very important for them to, know their responsibilities and also know what they should do and shouldn't do. Yes, I'll probably just stop here. Thanks.
All right. Thanks very much, Karen. Dennis.
Mhm.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever we are in the world today. So my name's Dennis Cladis. I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech. I've been here 2 or 3 years. And I've kind of been all over the map in terms of the science that I've done, my training. And when it comes to reviewing, my first experience was about 15 years ago when I submitted a paper and got the reviews back. And it was quite a shock to see, it was major revisions for a decent journal. But the first time I saw it, I was like, man, this feels really heavy. And then my advisor had to be like, no, this is very normal. Like, they're supposed to be critical, all of that. And from there, it's just been an evolving process of me submitting papers and getting the experience that way. And then as I completed my PhD and moved into my postdoc, my advisors would then send me papers to review. When I was a postdoc, they were like, hey, you know something about this, go ahead and do this. And then me jumping on any opportunity I could. I did my postdoc during COVID, so a lot of it was virtual, and just taking the opportunities and volunteering for journals. So yeah, that's been kind of my experience. And then I landed here at Virginia Tech and have been very involved with IFT. And now as an associate editor, I see a very different side of it because I get all those reviews coming back and I have to make decisions on the paper based on those reviews. So I've seen a little bit of everything in my early career, and it's been a journey. And I'm sure I'll dole out plenty of tips and advice, but I'll try not to get ahead of myself.
Well, thanks, Dennis. That's a good connection to kind of where I want to go to next. I know when I was learned to try and be a better reviewer, one of the best experience I ever had was becoming an editor. Because when you start to see reviews, you see them from a different point of view. It's not your own work that's being attacked or criticized. You're trying to make these decisions based on what other people say about it. So let's start our discussion about effective reviewing by thinking about, well, what do you do when you see a paper as an editor? How do you react to it? What have you found most useful, and what do you find kind of unhelpful in a review that you get in? So let's have Karen start this time if you can.
Well, my role in GFS is to assign papers to SEs. So actually, I don't really get any chance to see their feedbacks. So probably I'll jump on that.
Okay, fair enough.
Sorry on that. Yeah.
Dennis, do you want to pick up where you left before? What have you learned since you've been editing?
Yeah, so I think, quite honestly, there are varied opinions in science, right? We all can look at the same paper and come to very different conclusions on the quality of the science, the quality of the presentation, all of that. And so as I look at reviews, what's most helpful to me is when a reviewer, there's usually 2 fields. One is comments that are confidential to the editor, and one is comments to the authors. I love it when reviewers put a 1 or 2 sentence summary in the comments to the confidential comments to the editors that really tells me what they think about the paper, and they're very blunt and honest. That is so helpful for me in seeing and you can speak freely because the authors won't see it. People can say things like, this was the best paper I've ever seen, publish it right away. Or they can say, this manuscript is completely flawed and the science is absolute crap, reject it really quickly. And the authors don't see that, and that helps me to know what they really think. I use that when I'm reviewing papers to put something into the editors of like, hey, I've said this one time, I remember I put this in, good science, crappy writing, right? And that helped the editor know what needs to change. Or you can put the fundamental flaws in there. And then in the comments to the author, I smooth it out a little bit and try to be more constructive and break down each of those comments. But as an editor, when I'm supposed to read the paper and review it, and then I have comments from reviewers that are a mile long, none of us have time to read all of that. That's very helpful to the authors. But for me as an editor, give me the biggest things that we need to consider. So what my approach is generally is, are the methods solid? Did they use the right approach for their scientific question? If they didn't, then it's an easy, no, we can't move forward with this paper. If they did use reliable methods, then I move on to results. Are their results reasonable for what they did? If it passes those two checks and everything else in the paper is more massaging presentation, we can deal with that in revision. But it has to pass those two barriers, and that's really what I'm interested in as an editor. Give me that key feedback up front. I don't need a 10-page paper in a review, right? Nobody wants to read that. We all have enough reading and writing to do and enough busyness. Give me the summary quickly and then address the key scientific points of the manuscript before you get into the weeds and the details of, well, they really have a typo on this page and they should have presented this differently, all that. That's very secondary to, is the science good or not? And that's the real thing I need to know as an editor so I can make an informed decision on the paper. Because the reality is, and I'm sure my fellow panelists can tell you, as an editor, we're getting multiple manuscripts every week. And this is volunteer for us. So like, we all have our own jobs to do too. And so reading all the papers and reviewing them ourselves doesn't happen. That's why we rely on the reviewers to give us good feedback.
That's fascinating, Dennis. I think I like how you kind of separate out the audience for a review. Yeah, the author's an important audience, is going to read this, is going to respond to it. But there's also somebody else, the editor, who's trying to do something different with this information. And I like your focus on kind of brevity and action. Like what will we do next with this paper? I wonder how you responded to that, Joe.
I've been in sort of a different position. I've been the reviewer, and as I say, as editor, I get the paper after it has been accepted, and I had made the decision I was going to not undercut any of my associate editors, but I was going to make the paper what it ought to be. When I'm a reviewer, I have somewhat different approach and a different attitude, and it's partly because I do a lot of work with papers that are international. And my assumption is that many of these are papers from students or young professors starting out. And I almost always go for major revision on the first round because I raise so many questions and make so many editorials. I mean, I use the Fred Kroger method of reading papers, which is line by line. I do full language editing and add all kinds of questions into the text. It would be horrible for me, and it would be horrible for the editors to have to read all that. So once it's there, it's there. But I always feel that an author, these young authors, I can add a lot to what they're doing and help them get it right. And then it's sort of on the second round, because I assume that I will almost always get the paper back. It is at that second round that I then see, is the person, one, willing to work on it, two, have they made the improvements, particularly in the method section. People do not seem to know how to write a proper method section where the goal is that somebody can, one, repeat the work, and two, at least if it's not a method they know, they can at least understand it. And one of the worst areas, I should say, and I'm going to say it out loud, are the people working with modern biotech. I have read those papers. There are areas of those papers I do not know what they're doing. Yeah. And I feel very uncomfortable reviewing it, even if it's in areas of my expertise, supposedly mostly in fisheries in that area. It still is poorly done. So I try to give them time. Now that does not always appeal to the system. And so I actually resigned from being editor of Food Bioscience because Elsevier, which ran that one, at some point was not happy with our turnaround time because I didn't give a damn about the turnaround time. My goal was to take papers that my editors had said, my associate editors said, they felt was worthy, novel, sufficiently worthy of publication, and actually make it a publication that the authors could be proud of. It takes a lot of work. My wife, at one point, was almost happy when I was fired because I was basically spending my COVID years editing papers constantly. Basically, that was the major role I was playing. I was already emeritus. So at least this is the one thing I do. And what's happened is I'm doing less reviewing right now and more working with international students and early faculty, getting those papers ready before they go out for review. And that in some ways is easier because one, they give it in Word and it's a lot easier to do than PDFs. And two, I can really be stronger in what I'm asking because they also, as is the custom in many of these countries, insist on putting my name on papers. I have never asked an editing paper to have my name on it, yet the cultures of these countries are such that they do that. But it's a different philosophy. For me, it has worked.
Dennis, you look like you were going to react to that. I don't know. Any thoughts?
Yeah. And I would say much of what Joe is talking about is getting in the weeds, right? When we're reviewing papers, I think the biggest thing for me as an editor is give me the simple one-line answer.
Mm-hmm.
And don't be afraid to reject a paper. Like
Yeah.
I see many papers, and there's some that I scan through and I'm like, there's quality in the science, but this is just not ready for peer review. And I send it back and I say, you need to really rework this before we look at it. I don't do all the editing that Joe talked about. And remember, as a reviewer, your job is not to edit the paper. Your job is to evaluate the quality of the science and whether it meets the mark for the journal that it's submitted to. And so, like, if I'll be honest, we can all find a reason to reject every paper if we wanted to, right? And we can all find a reason to accept every paper. So be fair, be balanced in your approach, but remember that the bottom line is to be the guardian of science and to let in the worthy papers and to make sure that the things that are less high quality that just need to be rejected are rejected. And that's okay.
But part of the problem is that it's very obvious that these papers then go from one journal to the next journal to the next journal, and it's just adding a ton of work for other people because they don't die. I mean, they and these people are not learning, and I guess that's one of the luxuries of being emeritus. I admit that it is a luxury as an emeritus professor. It's one of the main things I'm still doing is editing. But again, a lot of it is I focus on the methods section because until the methods section is properly done, I can't judge the results because I don't know how well the work was done. It seems to work for me. It may not work for most reviewers who are still full-time faculty members or full-time working in industry or government.
Yeah, let's shift the focus a little bit. We've thought a little bit about how reviews can be useful to editors and how editors see reviews. Let's turn our focus now to authors, because if this process works, the review process should help the author make the paper better. Tell me some stories about how you respond to reviewers. Tell me about comments that you find particularly helpful. And you might also like to comment on the comments that have stung. I think particularly earlier on in our careers, a negative comment from a reviewer can completely undermine you as a scientist. I still remember a review from 30 years ago when I was first doing some lipid oxidation stuff, and the phrase, the author once again demonstrates his ignorance. And that stayed with me for all these years. I have no idea who this person was. I'm glaring at Joe now, just in case it's him. Does anyone want to jump in on that? Does anyone want to tell me a story about as an author how you react to this stuff? Karen, I don't know where you'd like to go on this.
Yeah, so as an author, I got a lot of feedbacks like for every paper, and usually there will be like 3 to 4 reviewers for each of the papers, and I think the opinions are very divided, and some of them are just like they give 1 or 2 sentences about like what they think is not good. So, and without any suggestions, that I don't really find those. I
Yeah.
think from that kind of reviews, I would think, well, they don't like my work. They probably have rejected my work. Then I will get upset a little bit, but I think I have good attitude after all these years of being a writer, of being an author. So I jump to other reviews that are the feedbacks that are very detailed because I need to respond to them in great detail one by one. So because of that, if they give me very specific instructions or detailed suggestions, by responding to that, by showing that I have made revisions based on their valuable valuable comments, I have already learned how to make my papers better. I think for authors, it is better for us to receive more detailed feedbacks because it really helps me like avoid making the same mistakes to another journal, even if I got rejected. I want to have, positive feedbacks from reviewers as an author, but I also understand from the role of editors, they want to, have straightforward reasons for rejecting a paper or to accept or major revision or something like that. But as an author, as a reviewer, I always try to help the authors, especially when I think these papers are worth publishing, but they just need some more work.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there should be a balance between, being, overly wordy on every detail, like each of the typos. I have received very, very long reviews that where the reviewer just, just to show me where I have typos by a lot of times. And I also have very simple ones. They just tell me that it's vague science or it's the like the significant, it's not clear or something like that, just 2 or 3 sentences, then that's over. And I think I want something in between, I think. Yeah,
I think
that's
it's,
what I think.
I
Thank
think
you.
it's really interesting. I really pick up what Dennis was saying earlier about specificity. Someone saying this is bad. Okay, what do you do? Someone saying these are the things you need to do. The concreteness is really important. You also comment about the length of reviews, and that sort of echoes a question in the chat from Chitan, who comments that when they started reviewing, they would write these like really long reviews, like 3, 5 pages long, and actually rerun statistics. Now they tend to write sort of shorter, sharper ones. Um, Dennis, and as an author, what would do you hear what Karen's saying about specificity, and is the length of the review an important thing for you to gain?
Yes. I think I would also preface this with my approach as a reviewer and as an editor is it's okay to go through multiple rounds of revision with a paper. If there's good science there, then my first focus as an editor is let's make sure the good science comes through and let's deal with that, any big issues related to that first. And then in a subsequent round of revision, let's deal with some of the more minor issues that may be with wording or phrasing or typos and things like that, and more presentation style issues. But I would say that's the balance for me is in a first round of revision, if there's major issues, let's deal with the major issues. And then in the second round, let's get more specific about the smaller issues that are needed to smooth out the remainder of the paper. But that's the balance for me. And what I like to see is let's not try and do everything all at once. It's frustrating for reviewers, authors, and editors to go through multiple rounds of revision. But it's also easier to deal with 1 or 2 major issues and then say in the next round of revision, we'll deal with some of the smaller things. And I've said that as a reviewer. Here are the major issues, 1, 2, and 3 that need to be dealt with. And then I say there are minor revisions in presentation style and things that I think can be addressed in further rounds of review, but we need to deal with the major stuff first. And that's helpful to me as an author as well. When I submit a paper, tell me what I need to do. And then once the big pieces are in place, we can smooth out those edges and get the style and the presentation correct in more of a second revision that's more minor than the first one. And so that's how I balance that and approach that. Don't try and do everything at once. It's okay. It's science. It's an iterative process. We go in the lab, we do a thing, we find out it didn't work. We go in the lab, we try it again. It works a little better, and then we keep smoothing it out. Same thing with peer review. Get the big things dealt with, then deal with the minor things, and be okay with multiple rounds of revision.
And I suppose you're right, Dennis. If there is like a fatal flaw in a paper, there's no point pointing out spelling mistakes at that point. We've gone beyond that. Joe, can you reflect on being an author and receiving review comments back?
One of the things early on, I agree with Karen. I mean, some of the reviews, again, and the one extreme I mentioned was useless, are not particularly helpful. I appreciate the longer, thorough review. Interestingly enough, I'm almost always, the first time I get it, when it comes back, I get so disappointed that there's so much that they found wrong with the paper, and sort of annoyed at myself or annoyed at the students who did the work, that we missed so much of what they found. And then the next day, having calmed down, I go back and look, and most of the time, or hopefully most of the time, they are really good comments that really help make the paper better. And again, early on, when I was not heavily reviewing, but more authoring, it was really helpful to begin to understand how what you said and what you did gets viewed differently by different reviewers. And sometimes, I mean, the one thing you worry about, and it's happened, you sort of have to do the fine. When the two reviewers, in a sense, go off in opposite directions from the same points you've made, and one wants to get more mechanistic, and the other says you're too mechanistic about this, the data doesn't support this, and the other author says, reviewer says, I want you to explain this in more detail. And so that's a little frustrating, but again, it makes you then look very carefully at what you've done and say, wait a minute, what are they both saying? Something is wrong here, and maybe I can improve my paper by thinking about both of those criticisms. So again, I find that the reviewers are very helpful. On the other hand, this business of multiple revisions, all the journals are very proud of their turnaround time. I mean, there's some things that journals do that I think are at cross purposes to scientific quality. I agree that multiple revisions is the way to go, but given the pressure to have a good time frame, I kind of do everything on the first round, unless there's a fatal flaw in the paper, and then it's probably time to quit. But most papers, on the first round, I can't even tell if there's a fatal flaw, because I don't actually, in unbelievably, most papers, I find the method section incomplete. So I try to minimize the number of revisions, because unfortunately, the system is not allowing us these days to do that process. That's the advantage of looking at papers before they are submitted, is I get to do multiple reviews, but and then somebody will say, well, but the student needs to, and in some countries, they cannot graduate without X number of papers, and that certainly China is in that category. And so there's this tremendous pressure, even when I'm informally reviewing, to expedite things. And that, again, I try to therefore, given the luxury at this point of being emeritus, try to do a great deal on the first round. So by the second round, ideally, my work is very limited. I do a little polishing and send it back and say, okay, it can be submitted now. Doesn't always work, but in most cases, at least, we move the paper much further along, much faster. And I would love to just do the big picture, as Dennis talks about, but then I get pressure to then accept the paper and move it forward. And unfortunately, the editorial systems are not making these papers readable. If we don't make it readable, I'm seeing a lot of papers being published that are unclear because they're poorly written, and therefore you can't understand what they're actually saying. And that I found
No,
very
I
frustrating.
would push back on that a little bit, Joe. I would say that, yes, there are systematic problems with the way science is done and the way journals try to keep review times down. And some of that's fair. But I would also say it's the responsibility of the authors to make sure the methods are clear and the presentation is clear enough that we can make an appropriate judgment. I fully understand what you're saying about the pressure universities put on students to publish, but that does not, in my mind, allow poor quality science or poorly presented science to be published just because they have a pressure to get that out. That's part of the scientific process, is spending the time on the writing and making sure the quality of the writing and the clarity of the writing is sufficient for publication. So I would say that's not on us as reviewers. That's not on the system. That's on the authors. And while I understand it's unfortunate, I find that many graduate students and early career scientists don't spend enough time writing. They spend a lot of time in the lab, they generate reams of data, but they don't spend enough time writing and refining the writing to get it to a point where it is clear and high quality so that it can be published. And that is a responsibility of the author, regardless of the external pressures that they may face.
Well, it's a responsibility of the author and their advice in the academic world of their advisors. And I've come to the conclusion that some of the advisors internationally are not capable of actually working with their students to do the papers. And that's the frustration. And again, I'm not arguing that what you're doing is what most reviewers do. I tend to, again, have the luxury of being emeritus. I spend more time on it, but I don't expect that other reviewers will do the same. But I think when the question of, and that's why these kind of webinars are so important, is to help students understand that they need to do these things. And if their own advisor is not capable of doing it, they need to find somebody else. And so sometimes I do simply suggest that you need to get somebody who has reasonable English to work on your paper, and you're not getting that from your advisor. And I don't say it that way. I just suggest that they might want to get an English editor to review the paper. And in some cases, that service is available and paid for, but most of the grad students don't always have access to the funds to pay for that. And that's a real problem in the internationalization of science, with English being the dominant language.
Okay, I'm going to push in. I appreciate you disagreeing. I think we often learn more from our disagreements than anything else. So thank you both for that. But I'd like to be kind of respectful of time and move on a little bit to perhaps some of the processes of reviewing, because many of the people interested in this stuff want to become better reviewers. And how should they go about doing this? So I've kind of got like a cluster of questions here, and I'll encourage you to kind of pick up any thread of it you want to. How do you do reviewing? So I'm interested in, what's your process? You get a new paper. I know Joe's very interested in method sections, but where would you start if you're faced with a new paper? Do you start at the beginning and just go for it? When do issues of presentation become important? Joe's spoken very passionately about clarity. Dennis is much more of an advocate for the sort of critical scientific flaws within a limit of it's got to be understandable. When do you talk about presentation, or when do you go for these big kind of issues? Are there things you see as like the common red flags? So sometimes if you're reviewing a paper, if you come across something which, do you commonly come across something which makes you say, I can stop reviewing at this point. This is a fatal flaw. There's no point pointing out spelling mistakes. And I think the last question, and I'd be fascinated how, because I find this really hard. I'm echoing a question that an anonymous attendee has dropped into the questions. How do you assess the quality of a manuscript? We're very often asked to speak to novelty and significance of work. And when it's in my field, I feel good about it. But very often we get asked to review things which aren't quite in our fields or were in our fields 15 years ago. How do you answer those questions? So there was a bit of a word salad there. but how do you go about reviewing is the big question. Karen, would you like to lead us off on this one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of questions.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
yes. Any bit you
Yeah,
want.
so I'll start with my routine on reviewing paper. So when I accept a invitation and I start reviewing, I basically firstly look at I actually my habit is to go from the beginning and to the end. I try to have enough respect to the authors, just to let them understand that I paid enough attention to this and I made unbiased decision. I mean, I can stop reading after introduction and just simply reject something, reject someone, but the manuscript, but I still want to see from the beginning, roughly to the end, probably. But it depends on the quality of the. I think the first impression is very important because, for example, I pay a good attention to the introduction part. I mean, yeah, somebody will, like Joe said, he will look for the method validation, but I think introduction is very important because it tells you whether it's something that is worth doing or it's something that will advance our understanding on a certain topic, or if it's worth the topic. I mean, there are a lot of times when I think the introduction is not coherent at all. Or, I mean, there are a lot of textbook information that is not interesting to me at all. And in that case, there will be less of a good impression on this whole manuscript. Then I think in that case, I will probably start looking for reasons to reject
Yeah.
instead of looking for reasons to accept, or make for them to help them um, revise their paper. Like I said, I understand when people have very simple or short reviews because they just simply don't like what I have presented. But there are a lot of times, like if they are very helpful, like if they try to help me and give me very clear directions, I think they at least see the merits of my work, and then they want to help me on, publish this paper quickly,
Mhm.
or without so many rounds, right?
Mhm.
If you give me very vague ideas of what I should improve, then I don't really get your signals, and then there will be mismatch. There will be a mismatch of our needs, and then there will be a second round and third one, and then probably just simply rejection if the reviewer think you just don't understand what I was saying. But I was like, if you have been more specific, I'll do better. That is
Mhm.
why I try to give them what detailed suggestions if I want to help. I mean, if I see merits in them in
Mhm.
the paper at the very beginning, like they have persuaded me this is something that is worth doing, instead of just there are a lot of that is the reason why I raise questions about novelty and significance, because it's basically an introduction. And there are a lot of times, like the authors would just say there's a certain topic was not studied before. I think that it's not a reason for me to judge this paper is novel, because the reason why something is never done before, it is probably because it is a common sense that is not worth doing,
Mhm.
because it's not related to a real life problem, or a practical processing a food processing problem, or food related issues. That is what brings us to study something in more detail, or just to understand the science. So I think if I understand the whole picture from the introduction, and then I'll be very happily just try to help this author. But if I see, they have just written the introduction in a very bad way, I would just think they didn't really pay attention to the whole writing, and
Mhm.
they probably they it's not worth the time, just to write a very, very long, detailed review for them. I think that's my point. I think that makes sense to you.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in
Yeah.
what you're saying. First of all, I think that what you said right at the start is just like out of respect for the author. And I think that's something that's really important for every reviewer to have in their hearts.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I also
Thanks.
liked
Yeah.
how your kind of
Mhm.
focus on the sort of novelty and significance almost at the heart of your review. It's that sort of critical last paragraph in the introduction. Why am I doing this thing?
Yeah.
And if you can find something there, it almost sort of sets your attitude towards the paper. Like I think you said it's that I'm looking for reasons to accept, I'm looking for reasons to reject. And it's a funny sort of psychological process when you're reviewing, you kind of making an opinion as you go through it. No, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank
Um,
you.
Joe, would you like to react to that at all? Or any
Well,
other aspects of this?
I start with the abstract, and the fact is when I'm asked to review, I look at the abstract, and I have rejected reviewing because the abstract was either meaningless or poorly done. And because I do this kind of work, in a sense, I reject the paper. And I often, in the comments to the journal as to why I'm not reviewing, I will actually put down some of this. The other thing that I struggle with the novelty, because there are things what I learned because I was in a department of poultry early on, and we had nutritionists, and they said, and they would reject all what they call feed and weigh. You can pretty much feed 5% of anything to chickens if you at least make some balance of the diet, and you can take any ingredient out there and do that. And yes, they are potentially useful, but it is very routine work. It's new information. Nobody has ever looked at hemp seed as a feed for poultry or feed for chickens. And I'm seeing some of that kind of work in food science, and it's novel in that maybe they're looking at people are hydrolyzing is one of the areas. I refuse to look at papers that are hydrolyzing to look at peptides because there's tons of it, and nobody ever uses a control of a peptide that has already shown high activity to find one with higher activity. They all look at their material, hydrolyze it, and do a whole bunch of tests to determine what's the best peptide that they've discovered there. And you can, given that there are thousands of foods, there are thousands of potential papers, but they're all formulatic. I mean, a lab could grind out hundreds of these kinds of papers. And so it's novel at one level, that's a material never been used, but the process and those papers read identical. And I've stopped accepting those because the other part is if the peptide's small enough, it's going to be synthesized. And that's not a way to upgrade byproduct materials. And that's what I struggle with is what are we doing, and are these just for publication? And I call that data collection. They should go in a data table, not in a peer-reviewed scientific paper. I don't have an answer of how to deal with it, but most of the time at this point, I take the luxury of just looking at the abstract and saying I won't even review it. And that's why, in some ways, I don't mind spending the time. Once I've agreed to review a paper, I feel I've made a commitment and I'm willing to work on it. And then I do read it straight through, though sometimes if the method section is unacceptable, I will stop and say I'm skimming from here because I cannot critically review your results if I don't know what you did experimentally. Your methods, I can't understand your methods, I can't review the rest of the paper.
Thanks, Joe. Dennis?
Yeah, so I want to go back to something Karen said about the introduction and the clarity of presentation, because I think when she was describing that process, it made me think, when I read an introduction, my first sort of benchmark is, do the authors understand what they're doing and why they're doing it? Because if the authors don't understand and they can't communicate that to me, I'm going to have a very hard time reading the rest of the paper. And so that, I think, Karen, you can feel free to disagree with me, but that, I think, is the essence of what I took from your comments and the way I evaluate introductions is, what are you doing and why? Convince me that your scientific question is important. Then I move on. And usually what I do is I give myself a half an hour time limit to read through the entire paper, because it forces me, well, not to do the review, but to read through once and make sure I don't get bogged down and too in the weeds at one point. So I keep the big picture in mind and get all the way through it. And that usually helps me to see, all right, is the story coming together? Is there something here? And then I spend the time to go back and do more of the detailed edits and things like that. The other thing I would say is regarding novelty and whether it's in my field or not. I do analytical chemistry. I have an LC mass spec. I'm semi-competent in that. And so if there's a method related to that, I can judge whether or not it's done properly and whether it's novel. I am not a food engineer. I am not a sensory scientist. And if those aspects come up, I will make a comment to the editor in that confidential comments. I am not qualified to judge the sensory one way or the other. And I just let the editor know, like, this is what I can do. And I free myself up from trying to understand a new area of science because it's outside of my expertise, and that's okay. As an editor, it's helpful to me if you just tell me, you don't know sensory? Great. I don't expect to see comments on sensory in your review, and I need to find another reviewer that can adequately assess the quality of that piece of the manuscript. But that's usually my process, is to go through it at a high level rather quickly and see if there's a cohesive story and the science it's at a high level makes sense. Will it be a valuable contribution? Will someone want to read this? Or, as Joe said, are we just recycling the same old experiment 100 times just to try and churn out papers? And there's nothing there that's really going to move the needle. So that's my process. I don't know if I got to all the questions you had, John, but there's a few of them.
Some people focus on the big picture. Some people just throw everything out. I'm afraid I'm a throw everything out person. No, I think it's fascinating. And I really like the point you put in the end of, like, don't feel obliged to review everything. If there's something you know a lot about, that's where you're going to add value. To launch into something where at best you can comment is like on the spelling, you're not really adding much value at that place. And perhaps telling the reviewer, the editor, kind of where your limits are can save everybody a lot of hassle, I think, there. We're running really short on time, and I want to be respectful of what everyone's trying to do today. So within about a minute, you've listened to some interesting people. I've learned a lot from it. If you could offer one piece of advice to somebody who's just starting out on their career as a reviewer, like, and it's got to be one point now, what would you suggest? I don't know. Just jump in if you want to lead off on that one.
Be respectful of the authors.
Yeah.
You're trying to help them, but you also want to be polite. There is no reason to be nasty. And every once in a while, one gets those nasty people, and it's very hard to take them seriously.
Yeah. I think sometimes when you do get a nasty thing, the best thing to learn from it is, I won't do that. That's hurt me. What I can learn, the only thing I can control here is I won't do that. That's a great point, Joe. And echoes what Karen was saying earlier, certainly.
Yeah, I think for me, I think responsibility is very important for us to be a reviewer. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind if there is a, for example, a conflict of interest. So don't do that, right? For example, if you know the author, just don't do it. And then try to be unbiased on the thing, and then give reasoning to the authors whenever it is a rejection or it's a major revision. I think the authors will be will be very grateful to this journal when they are convinced by your ideas. I mean, all they need, although they have a lot of problems on themselves, like they probably are not expert enough in writing or something. They also want, constructive feedbacks and also good reasoning, even it's a rejection. So my point, I still think it's better to be kind. And I mean, it's also a way to help the journal. I mean, I think as an author, I will be grateful to the journal, or I'll be more happy to, submit more papers to the journal if I always get good feedbacks. That's what I think.
Those are really good points there. I like how you sort of loop back to the being kind as within all of this stuff. One thing that we didn't get time to talk about is issues like conflict of interest and publication ethics. There will be another webinar event in the new year where another group of panelists will be exploring those issues. So, but it's really important to think about. Thank you, Karen.
No
Dennis,
problem.
last words.
I think I would say take your role as the gatekeeper and guardian of high quality science seriously. That is the role of a reviewer, is to make sure that good research gets published and presented well, and that flawed research does not. Take that responsibility seriously. Be honest in your assessment. I've had papers where I have a conflict, or not a conflict, but I know somebody personally on the paper that I'm reviewing. That can bias me positively or negatively. Try to eliminate that and be honest in your review and your assessment of the science itself. You're evaluating the science, not the person.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, enjoy the process. It's fun to learn new areas and to every time I review a paper, I learn something new because it's usually a little bit outside of something I've done, or I should learn something new because it is presenting the next frontier in science and a new and novel experiment. And so have fun with the process, learn something, and just enjoy it. Don't take it too seriously. Like take it seriously, but not too seriously. It's not, I mean, for Joe, it's appropriate to spend 5 days on a paper. For most of us, it's not. Just make that assessment, learn something, and keep it moving.
I think that those are really excellent suggestions. think sometimes we all get into a habit of sort of looking at the state of science, the state of scientific publication, and we can get very negative and panicking about it. But here is a place that we can have influence, even if it's just this one paper and this one response. Taking it seriously and trying to make this thing better is a very serious and worthy task. I'd like to thank you all for participating. There's an awful lot of experience here, and I certainly learned a lot from you. Honestly, I'd like to thank all the reviewers. There's so much work that goes into all of this stuff, and most of it's invisible and most of it is unthanked. So thank you all. Thank you for the participants who showed up today, and particular thanks to Amanda and Andy, who got up very early on the West Coast to do all the behind the scenes stuff. So have a good day or a good night wherever you are in the world, and hope you'll join for the next one of these things. Good day.